thank you. It's working? No, it's not working. Oh, it's working? No? Yeah, now it's working? Okay. So thank you very much for this invitation. It is a great honor for me to talk here because of my background. As you heard, I am coming from this area. So the title of my speech is, Are we ready to hear voices? And as was said, I am was writing a lot of Russian, so-called avant-garde, so I start with Russian. Nizhny Novgorod was in 19th century a provincial town in Russia where trade fairs took part that attracted at the town 100,000 of people also from abroad. Here the all-Russian industry and art exhibition was held in 1896. With a gigantic show, the exhibition was supposed to demonstrate Russia as a modern culture nation that didn't fall short compared to the Western civilizations. But something unexpected happened. The still unknown young painter Michael Wrubel submitted his paintings to a jury of the exhibition. The jury, however, refused them, totally upset. They were upset because Wrubel should have known that these paintings that are related to the formal language of icons with Russian folk art and even religious motifs could harm the reputation of Russia of being a progressive, modern nation. But however, how big was the surprise seeing this banished painting during the opening of the exhibition? They were presented in a pavilion built by the billionaire Sava Mamontov. He built this pavilion for these paintings right in the entrance of the exhibition. It caused a big scandal. Press was going totally wild. One of the most critical voices, and this is interesting, was the voice of the writer Maxim Gorky. Since then, French-speaking ladies of St. Petersburg and Moscow salons have been mentioning the name Wrubel only behind closed doors. Painting according to icon, how embarrassing. In this event, the paradoxical situation in which the Russia culture did maneuver itself in the second half of 20th century has been oscillating after those who had been educated on the university at Western knowledge, and these were members of aristocracy and the high bourgeoisie of St. Petersburg and Moscow, and who had committed themselves uncritically to the Western modern art, whereas the major part of the Russian population lived with the knowledge of the Russian Orthodox tradition and the icons. That resulted in two forms of knowledge and two forms of art and understanding of art that had been existing in parallel, whereas those who were educated in Western-oriented universities, who dominated the culture of the cities St. Petersburg and Moscow, not only closed their eyes to the culture tradition of their own country, they even restrained and prosecuted every effort to tie in with this tradition because they saw, referring to this knowledge, could damage the reputation of Russia as being a progressive, modern nation. So you see here, I forgot on the left, one painting done by Wrubel, 1890. This is a portrait of Sava Mamontov, who built the pavilion, and here you can see one element what Mamontov took from the icons was this construction of the space. You can see it if you compare the icon from the 15th century with the painting of Mamontov. This was, for instance, that he didn't accept the perspective built in West Europe was one of the arguments that he couldn't be shown in the exhibition. So Wrubel died in 1910, and he did never have a chance to exhibit his paintings in a public institution. In the same time, Ilya Repin, a painter of realistic Western style, took from Paris, was the president of Academy of St. Petersburg and the most expensive portrait painter of the aristocratic and bourgeois families, even of the family of Tsar. You see on the left one painting done in the 90s at the same time, basically as these paintings on the right from Wrubel in this naturalistic style, and on the right side you see paintings done by Wrubel. You can see in this portrait of his wife, again, this construction of space taken from icons, and he, in this very famous painting at the time, for the next generation then, you can see the background is going be already abstract. And this is paint about 1890 or something like this. But back to Repin, his painting, The Zaporozhe Cossacks, sold to the Tsar family, was the most expensive painting sold ever in Russia before the revolution, 1917. And it is an irony of history that this painter, this Repin painter, was later considered as a founder, and one of the person who did it was his friend Gorky, was considered as the founder of social realism. But this situation began to change after 1900. After the death of Wrubel, a new generation of artists, musicians, lyrics, and also scholars came who had been grown up with the icon in the countryside. Such artists like Natalie Gončarová, Michal Larionov, Vladimír Tátlin, the poet Velimir Chlemnikov, and Kazimír Malevich, who in his biography talks exactly about these two parallel existing concepts of art, of images. The one, how he is saying, the realistic paintings, what for Malevich were the paintings or the concept of art of the privileged people, and the icon, and this concept was for Malevich the art of the peasant, and he is saying in this biography, and for me was clear, I decided to stay on the side of the peasants. Artists started to appreciate Wrubel and with him their own tradition. This generation was no longer prepared to disavow its own culture origin and replaced it uncritically by Western culture. These artists were being confirmed in their search for own cultural identity by the art criticism of the writer Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky wrote several art critics, and these critics are still not known. They are not translated in any other languages. But most of all, by the thinking of a friend of Dostoevsky, the philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, who is also still unknown in the West, and who already in the 70s of the last century was criticizing the West European modern approach because of cultural imperialism and hegemony. The followers of Dostoevsky and Solovyov thinking considered then Wrubel as the first artist who in his art opposed to this striving of modern West European art for hegemony. And that's why with Wrubel, you can't think of Gončarová, Larionov, Malevich, and even Tátlin. According to this artist, to Larionov, Wrubel played for him a more important role than Cézanne, and the artist Naum Gábor even considered Wrubel as the founder of the Russian movement known as suprematismus. But what I am telling this story here? Because the situation in Russia on the beginning of 20th century is reflecting exemplarily the still existing relation of the Western aesthetics to all other remaining formation of art, of the Western art scene, who is, with its scholars, critics, and curators, dominates the rest of the world to all other forms of art. This relation is still similar to the relation between men and women in the art history. Quotation, men act and women appear. Men looked at women. Women watched themselves being looked at. Quotation. And these are sentences of John Berger from his today famous book, Ways of Saying, published in 1972. They are today not only familiar to feminists. Based on this study and referring to psychoanalysis of Jack Lacan, the US film theoretician Mary Ann Down was wondering in her famous, also now famous text, Film and the Masquerade, whether there are some possibilities for the female subject in order to elude herself from a visual world affected by a masculine view, and thus being relieved from the bondage of having two possibilities. The one, the masochistic over-identification with the active masculine view, or the other one, the narcissistic self-identification with the passive object being looked at. As for Down, one possible could be the masquerade, the practice of parody, because it could create a distance which makes the radicalness of this perspective immediately visible. As the next, the US thinker Judith Butler developed, based on this theory, a whole theory of parody as a strategy of critique and emancipation. If we transfer this concept of the active masculine view that looked at the passive feminine object to the relation of the Western aesthetics to the remaining art formation, then we can say that the one who belongs to the Western is the active viewer, whereas those who belong to other culture, ethics, and religious formations are considering being looked at. As the one being looked at, they are in the same dilemma of masochistic over-identification with the viewer's look, that means with the West European or US American art, or the self-identification being couched as passive objects. How can the one being looked at, belonging to another culture than the Western culture, find a way out of this dilemma? The Russian poet Velimir Chlemnikov, and with him, and he was the main figure in this movement in Russia, this is why I am starting with him, the poet Velimir Chlemnikov, and with him the artists Natalia Goncharova, Mikhail Larionov, Kazimir Malevich, and Vladimir Tatlin, faced such a dilemma at the beginning of the last century. They rejected to identify themselves with the dominated Western view, as Riepin, for instance, did, and also to consider themselves being passive objects. So how? By creating a distance to the Western view and to their role as being looked at in. And this aspect is not aware or is not known yet in using parody. They once painted according to icons, with native and motifs from the native Russian peasants. You can see here on the left side painting done by Goncharova. She was the first one who started with this painting oriented on the icons, and Malevich was one of the great Goncharova was a great favorite for Malevich, so he started 2 years ago, 2 years later, with these paintings like Goncharova did before. So they painted one after the icons with these issues, with these motifs. Then they painted like cubist. Then they painted impressionistic painting. Also, according to African sculptures, they painted abstract and figurative in the same time. So you can see this is the work of Malevich, so you can see these are all the styles he was using during his life, sometimes in the same time. He was painting in symbolistic style, in fauvistic, cubistic, abstract, then impressionistic again, then during the whole time after the icons, and then realistics again. In fact, with all these artists, you can not only see this promiscuity of style, but also other moods of parody. Goncharova, Larionov, and Malevich appeared painted and squeezed to their openings, and their performances in Cabaret number 13 were forerunner of the Dada performances in Zurich 3 years later. Here you see Goncharova with her painted face, and here you see this is an image from the film. It was one, and I think this was the first movie done by artists, 1914, done in this Cabaret 13, number 13. The texts of Malevich are full of abstract ideas, and the poet Chlebnikos was known for his Dada-like performances dominated by parody. John Boult, one of the best experts in the Russian development, even called the artist Tatlin an absurdist, and a friend of Tatlin, the Russian, very important art critic and theoretician Nikolai Punin, called his famous tower or monument, you can see it here, an ideological absurdity. You can see here this tomb, and it's known that Tatlin did in front or around this tomb performances. He was invited his friends for dinner, and they were sitting around the monument, but with the back to the monument, so that the visitors or the participants couldn't see the monument, and they also couldn't communicate, because if you sit like this, so you cannot communicate. So this was typical for Malevich. He did, for instance, also chairs. You couldn't sit on it, and he is known with this plane. You couldn't fly with it. So on the right, you see him with this plane. So John Boult called him, this American expert for Russian development, called him an absurdist, and as I said, Nikolai Punin named this monument ideological absurdity. And we should not forget that one of the closest friends of Tatlin was the later known poet Michael Harms, who belongs to the groups of poets called really themselves absurdists. And of course, it is not a coincidence that Mikhail Bakhtin, and this is also not known, Malevich was also connected to Bakhtin because he was a friend of Pavel Medvedev, who was living in the same time in Vitebsk, where Malevich was living, and Medvedev was a close friend, and scholar of Bakhtin. So this is not an accident that Mikhail Bakhtin, who was even rooted in this Russian artistic movement, is worldwide one of the most important theoreticians of the masquerade, the parody, and the carnival. So, in fact, it is obvious that also other artists not belonging to Western culture had in the art history worked and using parody and are still working with parody. In the 60s of the last century, for example, there was this Brazilian artist, Elio Oiticica, who was of African origin. And he was at first a part of this minimal movement, but then when he was asking him, what does it mean, this apply for purity and for formalism and to the more or less dirty life in the slums of Rio de Janeiro, and he did, after this, he was asking this question, he did this installation in Rio de Janeiro in 1967, where he was parodying with this former language somehow of minimalism, this approach that he was using or building this houses like the favelas, what were used in the slums or built in the slums in Rio de Janeiro, and he was more or less making joke about this approach, and he was also taking some elements of the folk art to this installation, like the palms or parrots, and it was basically a parody of this approach, and because of this installation, he was, after this screw out from this whole minimalist movement, so that in the books about minimalism and concept art, he wasn't mentioning it for 20, 30 years, and he was rediscovered as an artist, and this is the first installation or first exhibition of his installation Tropicalia. What you can see first, this black and white is the origin installation. It was lost, and this is the reinstallation done 2000 in Vienna in Foundation Generale. And yesterday we heard about this artist from Argentina who also left this modernistic way. So this was after this installation called Tropicalia, and also Oiticica wrote a manifest. It was a whole movement in South America going away, dealing critical with this whole approach of modernism coming at that time from New York. Another example of using parody is artists coming from Mexico City. And this artist, it's not an accident again, because this movement is somehow following to Oiticica, and because of this artist who emerged in the 90s, the international art scene realized also Oiticica became known because they were talking about it. He is one of the artists from New Mexico. His name is Eduardo Abaroa. On what he did in the 90s, this is the somehow similar. He built this broken obelisk, one of the icons of the American abstract art. He built it in this textile, and it is exactly the same textile what the Mexicans are using as a protection from the sun during the market. So he was going over the land, or he was driving with this sculpture made from textile and going from market to market and building it there and discussing with the people what this doesn't mean for them. So this was also a kind of parodistic way to deal with this tradition or with this approach of American art. So another artist and group of artists who is using parody is artists from Turkey. There is a whole group and a very strong movement just now. There are artists like Fikret Atay or Ferhat Özgür. This is one film done by Ferhat Özgür, where a Muslim woman is singing this Hallelujah. So it's also, this artist is using very often this strategy of parody. And I was just in Moscow, where I went because of the opening of Biennial, and there were also several works who were using parody. Just here, maybe one example, Elena Kovalina. She did, this is a movie called Égalité, and these are people coming with a chair, and they are standing then on the chair, and there is a one line, everybody is equal, so the line of the heads is there, but they are standing on chairs, and the chairs, I don't know if you can see it, but the height of the chairs is different. So this is how he succeed in this égalité. So this was one, and they are standing in front of Kreml, and the background, the sound of it is Internationale. And another, one of the most striking work in this Biennale in Moscow was a work done by 10 artists from Syria, called themselves Masasit Mati, and they did in an old manner like the folk theater, Syrian folk theater used to do. They did a puppet theater with, you see on the left, you see this is Assad dealing with his problems with anxiety, with his childhood. And in this situation, I think this is a way how to deal not only critical with the situation, but how to get somehow a distance or to emancipate themselves from this situation. So, but I don't want to talk only about parody. I want to talk about US American and West European gaze. See only what this gaze trained in the Western aesthetic is expecting. What I mean with it. The best example is the Russian so-called avant-garde movement at the beginning of the 20th century I was talking about. The Western theoretician and art historian understood this unusual development as a continuation of a modern movement initiated in Paris that indeed had a number of unique characteristics, but it basically represented the same like the Western modernism did. They understood it as a confirmation of their own priority, superiority, and predominance. They selectively looked for something that had been confirmed by this interpretation. Abstract paintings by Malevich, yes. His later paintings of Russian peasants, and even his realistic paintings, no. His cubistic paintings, yes. His early paintings of Russian peasants, less. His writings, who from the scholar can really read Russian? Goncharova's profane motifs, yes. The images of saints, no. Titlin's monument, yes, but not his performance full of absurdities. And Kandinsky paintings, yes, but his biographical text, according to Hans Rötl, the former director of Berlin Museum and the editor of Kandinsky collecting writings, who wrote the introduction for these writings, Kandinsky was a great painter, but you cannot take seriously what he was writing because he didn't know what he writes. This writes Räthl in this introduction for this collective writings of Kandinsky. And Kandinsky studied law in Russia and completed this study with doctor degree and was appointed as a professor in Russia. So I think that he really knew what he was talking about. If the Western theoretician would have taken this text seriously, just as those of Malevich and, for instance, of a friend of Malevich, Roman Jakobsen, who later became a world-famous linguist, then they would have known that this movement was critical, even parodistic, towards many paradigms of modernism, such as the belief in progress, the interpretation of abstraction as final peak of modern development. And here you see paintings done by Malevich, done between 1930 and 1933. And you see that on the left, he painted a friend of him, and in background you see the square on the wall. Then this is a self-portrait, and he signs this with the square on the right side down, and this is one of his last paintings done in realistic, little impressionistic style. This is a portrait of his friend Ivan Kuhn. You know maybe these portraits of Kuhn in Kubo-futuristic style or in this style like an icon. So, and they would realize that although Malevich and Chlebnikov called their works consciously za this means behind or beyond reason. Actually, from this point of today, this postmodern critic, with this postmodern critic, the Russian artists were one step ahead in the development. But, and this is the problem, those who considered themselves as peak of the development, such as the Western culture did, cannot expect any other peaks. So that's why you only see what you expect. Again, why do I tell all this? Because 100 years later, only a little has been changing, apart from the fact that today, it is not only about the relation of Western ethics of scholars and the Russian art, the problem has become global. Chinese, Indian, Czech artists, and even Inuits in Alaska are still in the same dilemma, identifying themselves masochically with the expectation of the active viewer. Those are even these people belonging to Western art, like curator of the most important museums or of biennials, of documenta, or stay passive in narcissistic self-pity identification. I am living, as I was saying, in Germany, but because of my Czech origin, I am following since years the Czech art scene. And it's so sad for me to see that there are these both sides. They are artists, more art critics or curators and theoreticians who still have this masochistic attitude and are following mostly, or sometimes with some years of delight, the trends and languages and expectation established in Western. And on the other side, they are this group, or the other side of this passive staying in narcissistic self-pity identification. But what possibilities do these artists, curators being looked at have to be active part of the global art? Parody, like the Russian artist or the artist Oitichika? This question is to discuss. But not only the Russian movement we start to understand only now. It took more than 30 years until the West European art historian noticed and understand the Brazilian artist Helio Oiticica. And yesterday we were discussing here about this. I need, in 5 minutes I will be there. Okay, yesterday we were discussing this approach of art history, if this should be a horizontal or vertical, or there was somebody talking about diagonal. I think this is everything the same, because as long as you stay, as long as you accept this concept of art was established or constructed by this West European art historian, so you are lost, because what you are doing is you are showing that also in Prague was an important center of surrealism, or that this Polish cantor was also painted also abstract paintings. What you are doing in the end, you are with this just conforming the feeling or this approach of West Europe art or West Europe history of superiority and predominance. So I think the only way how to deal with this problem is to leave this concept of art based of this construction of West European art critics and historians, and look for movements that are not part of this canon. I liked very much yesterday this idea of Tomáš Pospíšil to deal with the realism, because realism, if there is a taboo in this West European canon, then this is dealing with realism. And why Oiticica, for instance, why nobody wasn't aware of Oiticica's installation in the 60s, because it was at that time totally taboo to use elements of folk art, for instance. And this was the reason why at that time the art critics who were writing about concept art and minimal art were saying that Oiticica was not a clean or really minimalist artist. He was, one art critic said in Germany, he was verunreinigung, the idea of minimal art. He made it dirty or something like this, because there was this idea of purification also. So now, to this assumption, I was also very skeptical toward Documenta 11 curated by Envezo Okui in 2002. In this project, Okui announced to give people previously being looked at the chance to talk. His concept of art was already clearly defined before the people being looked at could say anything at all, and nobody would deny that this concept was a result of an intellectual discussion or discourse, as you say now, at only a few elitist universities on the west coast of the United States. Thus, by establishing this concept of art globally, even mountain dwellers in Tibet, nomadic people in the Sahara, and Inuits fishing in Alaska had to bend to that concept. He only pursued the culture imperialism of the western part of the world. Because in his concept of art, natives of other culture, religious and ethical formation were not allowed to say anything. And even, I don't know if you remember, the Inuits acted in accordance in their video, what you could see there, with the principles of post-conceptual aesthetic during the presentation of their politically correct video work at Documenta. The last Documenta, curated by Karolin Christiev-Pakiev, I have to say, was trying to open space, really to open space, for all these voices of artists previously being looked at, but are we really ready to hear these voices? And can these voices really speak? The Indian thinker and activist Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, or Spivak, and she is the author of this famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Known for her post-colonial critics, called these voices from different ethnic, culture, religious formation, not only subaltern, but also native informants. And as the last statement, I would like to give voice to this brilliant woman theoretician. Quotation: as the historical narratives move from colony to post-colony to globality, the native informant is thrown out, to use the Freudian concept metaphor of Verwerfung, into the discursive world of a cryptonym, inhabiting us so that we cannot claim the credit of our proper name. So I thank you for your patience.